Welcome to Legal Innovation Spotlight, the podcast that brings you the latest advancements in legal tech and knowledge management. I'm Ted Theodoropoulos, and I connect with the industry's brightest minds to provide you with valuable insights and actionable takeaways. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Torie and Myka, thank you guys for joining me today.
Thank you. Morning.
So the three of us and a couple others delivered a presentation at ILTACon this year in Orlando, and the topic was making teams work for the legal world. And I think it was very successful. We had seating for 300, and most, if not all, the seats were full, and we had people standing up around the room. So, and they had to walk. That was in the yacht club building. So people had to walk through the heat to get there. So it was very well attended, and we got great feedback after. So I thought, hey, for all the people that didn't see it, this would be a great way for us to maybe share some of that same information. So I really appreciate you guys joining. And before we dive in, why don't we just do some quick intros? Torie, why don't you start?
I am Torie Carrillo. I am with Nelson Mullins, Riley & Scarborough. I am the firm's applications manager. I've been with Nelson Mullins for 13 years, and I've been in the legal industry for over 20.
Myka?
Myka Hopgood. I'm with Dykema, and I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Legal Innovation there. I head up our KM efforts as well as our innovation efforts and a few other things on top of that. I've been at Dykema for a little over 10 years now. I started out as a practicing attorney many years ago. I don't want to date myself too much, but I have been in legal for well over 20 years as well.
Gotcha. Well, and I think you're both, so my company Infodash and the predecessor company AcroWire, we've worked with almost half the AmLaw, over 90 AmLaw firms, and so we have a pretty good cross-sectional view to see what firms are doing or not doing with technologies, specifically M365 technologies like SharePoint and Teams. And you guys are way ahead of the curve. So there are a ton of firms that are using or dabbling with Teams, and they're using it for online presence, kind of free busy. They're using it for chat. And they're using it for online meetings. But beyond that, it's pretty rare. So I think there's going to be a lot more of that as 2024 and 2025 roll out. But I think firms are just now honestly getting to Microsoft 365 in the AmLaw space, which is kind of incredible considering other industries made the move 10 years ago. Or 8-9 years ago. So I think that's kind of part of the driver. But you guys are both, Nelson Mullins and Dykema, are way ahead of the curve in terms of how they're using Teams. So this is going to be a great conversation. So why don't we start off with, I guess, at our ILTA conversation was more kind of 101. We're going to do kind of a 102 here and talk a little bit more in depth about some more advanced topics. And you're both using Teams for client matter work, but if we back up a little bit, let's talk about some of the motivations. I mean, everybody knows that emails are the bane of people's existence, including mine. Attorneys just live in Outlook, Word, and sometimes Acrobat, but reducing email volume is never a bad thing. How much of the motivation, Torie, at Nelson Mullins was driven, at least initially, by just reducing email volume?
I think quite a bit. Part of it is not just from a technology perspective, but from our attorney's perspective, having things in one place. So when you're in email, if you're not foldering your mail well, you're still having to search through Outlook. When you put items in Microsoft Teams and you have it organized well, then there's one place easily accessible for them to go look and search for items. And that made a huge difference for a lot of our teams, our attorneys, because they're getting so much information internally. And if you add the client or co-counsel to the team, it's one consolidated location for them to find it and be up to date, especially if they happen to be on the phone with the client and they've got 3 or 4 different attorneys working on a case and a couple of paralegals, and they need a quick response for the client. Where are we on this? They can send a message in Microsoft Teams, get a quick answer, and it's right there. So
Myka,
it made a big difference.
What about you, Myka? Like, how much was communicating differently? How much of a driver was that for? Because Teams, it does a lot of things, right? I mentioned chat, presence, online meetings, but kind of taking it to the next step, doing client matter work in Teams. Like, was there a significant component of this that was aimed at reducing email volume?
That was part of it, definitely, because what the complaint that you would get, attorneys wouldn't really know how to fix the issue, but the complaint that you might get is you have a number of attorneys on a team working on a particular matter. Maybe they're spread across offices, and in reality, it doesn't matter if they're in the same office. They're sending documents back and forth on email. So you've got numerous emails, you've got numerous strings of emails. So then you end up with duplicative emails going into the document management system. And then on top of that, you've got all these documents kind of flying around. There are ways to share those documents without, sending a copy in each email, but a lot of people, that's kind of a habit. So a lot of people would do that. And then you're starting to lose control of the document, and you just have voluminous emails that you can't dedupe effectively. So that was a complaint, and Teams really does address that. Does require a bit of a change in your work process, but once you get the hang of it, you can really save a lot of clicking, a lot of additional communications, and you can really keep control of those documents as well.
Yeah. So findability is obviously a driver. I mean, so even if you map things out with kind of client teams, matter channels, there's still, for a big, like, ongoing matter, you probably still, if you do it in posts, there's still a ton in there. Like, Torie, how do you guys manage that? Are they still searching? Are they scrolling? Like, how do folks find information within the channel itself?
So the way Nelson Mullins broke it out is we do a team per matter. So it's not based on client, it's based on the matter. So it's one case, one Microsoft team. So it helps lessen some of the amount of data, and it's particular to that case because there are some limitations that people need to be aware of. In a Microsoft team, you still can only do 200 channels per team. So if you've got one client and you're in a big law firm, you could run right into that limit quickly. So there are things like that that you need to be aware of. So we do one matter per team, and then we teach them how to connect, or we've connected it through a third-party tool, our Microsoft team, into our Net Documents environment. So that also helps pull the document from the authoritative source, our DMS, which is Net Documents, into the Microsoft team. So you always know you have the current version of the document. They can collaborate, they can co-author on the document, but it's always the current version. You're not trying to figure out, well, which email is it? Is it the last one? Do I have the most? Is it the right one? You have it. It's right there for you.
I see. So, Myka, do you do the same kind of information architecture? Is it one team per matter, or are you doing one team per client? What's that look like?
It is one team per matter. Because, as Torie mentioned, it does allow you to keep better control over that matter. If you were to do something where you've got client level, you're going to you're really going to lose control over what's in what matter. You're going to end up with a similar problem to the emails from me scrolling and probably going through too many channels. So we do have it set up that way as well. I did recently have one of our attorneys ask about doing something at the client level, which we are opposed to, for the control reasons. But we are going to explore and see if there's some way we can accommodate something. So we are looking at maybe a template that might help them with a few different things.
Yeah, that seems like a great use case, actually. Well, first, before we dive into that, what you both describe aligns with Microsoft's new strategy. I mean, Teams is SharePoint behind the scenes, most of it, right? Teams and what used to be Skype for Business or Office Communicator back in the day. But the way that you're describing it aligns with Microsoft's new kind of horizontal information architecture strategy, right? Even in SharePoint Online, like de-emphasizing, or I don't even know if you can create subsites now. It's kind of site collections and pages. So that lines up well with the way Microsoft wants you to go. And swimming upstream against the way Microsoft wants you to go is never a good idea because it causes pain, as I'm sure we've all experienced. But back to the question of, a client team, that seems like very logical to me. Like, like a client team with a capital T, like a client Microsoft team, because you have a internal client team, I would assume, right? Or even if it's not a formal, mechanism, you have attorneys, multiple attorneys, maybe working on different matters for the same client. So sounds like, Myka, you're looking into that. Torie, do you manage any client level dialogue, artifacts, all that stuff, chat or posts at the client level in Teams?
We manage it at the matter level. We are really opposed to doing it at the client because some of our clients are huge. So we could have 200, 300, 400 matters for a particular client because it's a different type of work. So we want to have it consistent, basically for e-discovery purposes, or if there's something that needs to be put on a litigation hold, how do you unwind it if it's at the client level? It's too voluminous. There's going to be way too much to dig through. So we are pretty strict about it needs to be matter level teams so that we can keep it consolidated. And as you mentioned, it's SharePoint underneath. So we use a third-party tool. It's Intap's Workspaces to allow us to create it by client matter number for traceability reasons. Now, the client, the attorney, can rename that team so that it's a more friendly name for them as they're working on the case. But the creation is based off of an authoritative source, our client matter number. So we can track it back should we need to for e-discovery purposes. That's really important for us because Microsoft puts things in so many different places. Sometimes it's SharePoint, sometimes it's the team mailbox, sometimes it's OneDrive. It just really depends what the user's doing. So we need to have a way to trace it and then be able to find it based on that particular matter, should we need to copy it or put it on hold.
So things like let's say a company gets bought or buys another company or something that isn't necessarily matter specific, but kind of at the client's organizational level, where does that kind of thing get communicated? Torie, are you guys still doing it just email, keeping it out of Teams?
So it depends. If our law firm, if our attorneys are working on the purchase, that would be a matter. So that's a type of law. So we would probably open a new matter or should be opening a new matter for the renaming of the purchase of one company to another. So that information would be handled in that particular matter. It's sort of that type of work.
Yeah, I didn't ask that question very well. Like if let's say there was a merger and like there were organizational changes that potentially impacted the relationship between the firm and your client. You know what I mean? Like, or they opened up a new geography or a line of business, and maybe it's an opportunity to, jockey for more legal work or something like that. Like, where do those types of communications happen?
So if I'm following you, I think that's more like the matter, our business development type work. But if they're trying to get that work, if they haven't actually gotten the work and they're just trying to market for that legal business, that's typically done in a different area. The matter work is the work that our law firms have actually started. So we don't, as of today, do, I would say, like business development or that type of, I'm trying to get the legal work, I'm trying to get work on a new geographic location with an existing client. That's sort of the pitch type things, and that's typically done in our DMS.
Gotcha. And what about you, Myka? Do you guys do any sort of, and I like marketing, like RFP responses, all that kind of stuff, but a lot of attorneys are responsible for cross-selling and stuff like that. Like how did those communications go at Dykema, Myka?
So I think you're talking about sort of like the business of law end of things, right? Like, so what we were thinking about, and I agree with Torie completely here on the governance of the matters. We have to be able to control if we need to put legal holds in place, or if we've got a discovery request, or we've got ethical walls, things like that. We absolutely have to keep everything locked down in teams by the matter level. So when we start looking at the client, we do something at the client level, we would be looking at more of that high level reporting. Maybe the client requires a certain type of reporting at the client level for certain things. Maybe they've got diversity, equity, inclusion type requirements they want reporting on. Maybe they have just some sort of general financial situation. So that would be how we would set that up. We would lock that into that kind of communication. And we do have teams that are not client matter based. We refer to them as administrative teams. I've been thinking about changing the name of it because it's more project based, but that would allow our business development team, for example, to set up teams and work through, various issues that they have, or maybe you've got, we do have practice group leaders who use it to sort of govern the practice group issues, so they'll have a channel for BD and they'll have a channel for, new policies they want to put in place or travel or something like that. So we do have some of that. There is a risk there, right, that someone will start putting matter data into one of those teams. So we do have them go through an approval process to set up a team like that. We do check in with them just to make sure that nothing is, kind of going astray. But that's basically how we work through that.
You make them sign a disclaimer? I've heard of that. I have heard of that, actually, where in order
They'll
to
sign
create...
it, but they'll do what they want.
Probably true. Well, that's a good segue into, Torie, you were starting to talk a little bit about some of the limitations, like with the number of channels you can have in a team, but there's also limitations around other areas. And I remember you had rattled some off when we did our ILTA presentation. What are the key ones that people need to be aware of?
I think it's the number of channels per team, 200. So one of the things, like Myka mentioned, you can create a Microsoft team based on anything. So when we started testing Microsoft Teams, we set it up for one of our internal legal teams. And they immediately just thought, well, I'm going to create a channel for every matter that we're working on. And we weren't quite prepared to roll out our full implementation of Teams. So this was a test for us. They blew right through that 200 channel limit. And then the other piece of that is there's only 30 private channels that you can have. Okay. And it doesn't matter if you delete a channel, it's still counted. So Microsoft has these limitations that you need to be really aware of before you start down that process. And that sort of was one of the impetus of we have to have a better way to do this. So we worked with Intap to do the client matter specific team. I think some of the other items that people need to be aware of is what can owners do compared to what can a member do. An owner can add other people to it. So if they're not aware that there is an ethical wall, they could add an attorney or add somebody to a case that should not be seeing that data. So you need to ensure that you have a way from in the firm to protect them from themselves, because they're just trying to get the work done and they're going to add somebody to it unknowing that that person is excluded and not able to see that data. So things of that are really important. And then when you're launching a Teams call, let's say you're in the channel in a Microsoft Matter workspace, and then you're in a channel and you've got 50 people in that channel. You're not going to get everybody in there because there's limitations on how many people can participate in a video call when you launch it from the channel compared to when you launch it from a team. So understanding some of those differences within Microsoft is important, and training your users that there is a difference between a team chat, a general chat. Where are you when you're chatting? If you're just chatting one-on-one, you can do it in various places, and understanding the difference between that and how or where that data is going to be saved is important. At least it's important for a law firm.
Yeah, I know. And this was an interesting part of the presentation as well, is the difference in, well, first, you guys both, which I think is very smart, you both lock down chat, right? So if you're just chatting in a, in a non, not in a team in a channel, but just through chat, there's no real way to link that dialogue with a particular matter. Things get lost, and you both have policies around that. Myka, what is the policy at Dykema?
So our policy is 14 days. We recently revisited it to see if we needed to make it shorter. But we've had that policy for quite some time. I think we put that in place back when it was Skype. Actually, we had started out with a shorter policy. I think we started out with 48 hours. Ran into a couple of problems because people were trying to communicate about logistics when they were prepping for trial, and they lost the conversation thread, obviously. So it created a little bit of a hiccup for them. So our GC decided, well, let's go with 14 days. That's a risk we can take on discoverability. And that has been working pretty well now. I think people are so used to it now, they don't think anything of it. I know Torie's is shorter.
Yeah, I was going to say, Torie's is much more aggressive.
Ours is 72 hours. And, Microsoft has its own way of running those scripts. So even though you say it's 72 hours, it's not exactly 72 hours. It could be a little shorter. It could be a little longer. But we consider that direct chat water cooler. You go to the water cooler, you get a cup of coffee or whatever, and it's that conversation. It's not meant to be kept. It's not meant to be an official record. So understanding how Microsoft runs those and knowing that 72 hours is not necessarily 72 hours after I press enter, it kind of has its own schedule to run through, is important. So people just need to know if they have something that is sent through a direct chat and it's important for them to keep. You're scheduling to meet or scheduling with a client for something, and you need to ensure that you guys are meeting at the same place or at the same time, or who's doing what. Grab it, grab that information, put it in a different location, put it in the calendar, and that's the other thing. Your team's calendar is your Outlook calendar. Calendar is calendar. So keep that. I think long term, where's Microsoft going with Microsoft Teams and Outlook? They kind of feel like they're merging to me. In a couple of years, will Outlook be a thing of the past, and will it be Microsoft Teams as your Outlook? Possibly.
Yeah, it kind of feels like what iMessage did, on the SMS front. It's like a much more capable email, and there's interoperability obviously between if you're an iMessage user versus not, and Microsoft has great market share, but it's not 100%. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. What about naming conventions? So, Myka, what do you do? Torie mentioned that they use Workspaces to create the initial team name based on client and matter number. What are you guys doing at Dykema?
Yeah, so it's the same thing. So essentially what happens is when a matter is created in our financial system, that communicates back to teams, and you have a list of matters that have our naming convention, which starts with your client matter number and then has your client matter name. You can then select from that list, what you want to select to create a team, and then it will retain that name. We don't allow our attorneys to change the name. I think that that's really a nice feature that Torie has over at Nelson Mullins, but we force them to stick with a certain over name. And then we also include a OneNote notebook as part of that team. Not everyone wants to use that, but I will say it's very popular. That also retains that name. So we keep that naming convention on that notebook so that it's a bit easier to find and deal with.
Interesting. And then what about ethical walls? We've kind of touched on that a couple of times, like how the ethical walls are typically tightly coupled with your DMS, right? Like, Torie, how are you managing those scenarios where somebody doesn't get inadvertently added when they're part of an exclusionary wall?
So part of it is we use Inap Wall Builder to manage our ethical walls, and that integrates with the Inap Workspaces. So when the workspace is created and they want to add people to it, they're told that there's an ethical wall, and it checks when they add the user. And that happens also on the back end. So let's say the team's already created and they're working, and 2 or 3 weeks later, they need to add additional people. It will validate that the person is accurate and able to see or be added into that Microsoft team. So it's sort of a double protection for us. You can't see the document or DMS. You can't see the Microsoft team.
And I assume the same true, Myka, for you guys?
Yes, that's right. We use Inap walls. We've been doing some upgrades with Inap, so we've kind of moved everything into their cloud model. It does integrate obviously with Inap Workspaces. That was one of the reasons that we held off on allowing attorneys to use Teams initially, was we did not have a good way to A, integrate into the DM, and B, control the ethical walls until we could find the right kind of tool to help us with that. And, just because it's so incredibly important, you don't want to have that kind of exposure. So it does integrate. I will say, it's tricky, and because there's different kind of walls, and so you always have to double check everything to make sure those walls are actually being touched and included appropriately. It does take an effort. I know Torie's more technical than I am, so I know she knows more about this than I do, but I will say it does take some work. We went through, a period of time making sure that was set up correctly.
Yeah. What was your experience, Torie? Did you have challenges like Mike is describing?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely different walls you can set up: inclusionary, exclusionary, foundational, that can be across multiple matters. And validating all of that to ensure it lays correctly is very important. We are in the process of taking those ethical walls and applying them to a network store, basically a file share, so that we can manage the same ethical wall requirements between our DMS, our Microsoft Teams environment, and our network location. Because there's always going to be files that are too big for the DMS, or they're too large to put in Teams. It could be, a 2-hour video for something. And so you need another location to put it, but you also need to ensure it's properly stored. So making sure your walling system is tested up to date. And it's one of those, every time there's an update, you got to retest. You got to test that patch. You got to validate everything's layering correctly. So it's constant, go back and validate.
Wow. What about retention beyond the chat scenario? Like what sort of retention policies are you guys putting on the teams themselves? What does that look like at Nelson Mullins Torie?
So all of our teams, because they're based on client matter numbers, follow our information governance records management policies. As long as the client matter is open, then it's an active team. Once the client matter in our financial system gets closed, then it starts the counter for records retention. And I will say that on average, we're at 7 to 8 years on a matter before we look to ask the attorney, what do you want to do with it? Do we destroy it or do we return it? Now, of course, the engagement letters based on the client matter could be different, where at the closure of the matter, the client may want their data back or they may want it destroyed immediately. It just depends on how that's written. But on average at Nelson Mullins, we'll hang on to it 7 to 8 years. And then we look to see what we need to do with the data. And a lot of times we are allowed to destroy it, but we consistently run that retention or that destruction process across multiple authoritative environments. So our DMS, our Teams environment, the network share, because it's all based on the client matter number.
Is that same with you, Myka?
Yes, very, very similar. Although we do have an opportunity for someone to have a team go dormant and archive it prior to a matter closing. But we do follow our firm retention, which, the majority of which is 7 years. We do have different exceptions for that. And then, of course, if our client requires a different retention policy, we will apply that retention policy through yet another third-party tool. But during the life of the team itself, we do check back with the owners every 6 months so that if they are no longer using the team, but that, can still be open, but maybe they're not using the team, they do have an opportunity to archive that team. In addition to that, we have applied a retention around posts that is identical essentially to our retention policy around email. So that was a GC decision. And basically the way it works for us, we have a 1-year retention policy on email. And then if you need to keep that email, you would save it into the document management system. With the posts in Teams, we have a 1-year retention policy on those posts. If you want to save it longer, you can, there's an automated provision. You just click save. It will automatically PDF the post and it will port it over to the workspace in the document management system. So that is a little bit different than the team as a whole. But that's sort of, we put that in place just because we think people, may or may not want to keep all those posts for that long.
Yeah. What about attachments in posts? How does that work? You lose those when you PDF them? I assume you do.
Yeah, I think you do.
Yeah.
We also
you guys have
used with some of the, if someone puts a document in a chat, like just a chat, a regular chat, you can't delete it ever. So we're sort of telling people these things so that we don't get caught up in that. But as far as an attachment in a post, that you will likely lose that when you PDF your post. But what will happen later is we should be able to sweep it along with the rest of the team information and pull it into the DM when the team is closed.
Gotcha. Well, the last big topic we wanted to talk about, which is, I think, one of the most interesting use cases for teams, is kind of external access, opening this thing up to clients. And the reason I think it's so interesting, I mean, so Infodash is a intranet, extranet platform, and we integrate very closely with Teams. And Teams is SharePoint underneath the hood, but Teams has the capability, something that SharePoint doesn't have, with shared channels to create a very frictionless mechanism for external parties to select external parties to get to your internal Teams tenant without a separate URL, without a separate set of credentials, without a different user interface. And, today, most of that external collaboration happens through like HiQ. And from a inside counsel perspective, that's not ideal because, again, I've got separate URLs, I've got separate sets of credentials, everybody customizes their extranets differently. So if I'm a GC and I've got 40 panel firms, that's a very unwieldy scenario, very unwieldy. So I'm of the view that Teams provides really the most frictionless way for law firms to expose and internal resources and collaborate. Now, Teams has incredible market share in the enterprise. So 91% of the Fortune 100 use Teams as their primary collaboration platform. That's pretty amazing. So what I think is going to happen is it's going to be part of the RFP. Law firm clients are going to say, hey, look, this is where we collaborate, meet us where we are. And if you aren't prepared for that, they may say, okay, no problem, use our tenant, which would be a nightmare, right? For all the reasons, all of those nice, neat security mechanisms, retention policies, you lose all of that, right? And now you're subject to the constraints of your client. So not ideal. So I think it will be a huge game changer. But Myka, you're starting to, or you've already started down this path. Is that correct?
That is right. So we were nervous about a number of things. Security, ensuring things are set up correctly so that people don't have too many rights, etc. And we do have one client that we've actually federated with, so they're, basically we're sharing in chat, definitely. With Teams, we can add somebody externally to a team just as a standard practice, but there were some things about that we didn't love. Primarily, can you accidentally share a document or a post or something like that with an external party? And our attorneys are very careful. I know that they're very professional, but it's just one of those things that something can accidentally happen. So we did explore and ended up going with Inap Workspaces, creating external teams that way, which what it does is it essentially creates an additional team. So you can manage your teams. You can easily see what you have internal versus external. You can have an internal team on a particular matter and have your external team, and the client is only allowed into that external team. That has just offered us an additional protection. Anything, you can connect to the DM and pull those documents in to work with the client. You've got a seamless integration there. They only have access to what you give them access to. So that is, we just started that. We ran into some testing we had to do. We had a couple bugs where, you would set up, it was sort of like you would set up one team, but then if you tried to invite the external party to another team, you couldn't. So that was a bug, but we got through that. But I will say this, you are absolutely right on who's got control of the documents. That in some cases turns into a bit of, I don't want to say a battle, but we have come across situations where the client does not want to use our team because they want to keep control of their documents. And so they want us in their team. So I think this is going to be a negotiation point with many clients.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, some I worked in financial services. I was at Bank of America for 10 years back in the day. They are a very heavily regulated industry, the alphabet soup of regulators, that are constantly in there doing examinations and asking tough questions. And every time there's an event, a kind of a macro event, they come up with new rules that the organizations have to follow. Sarbanes-Oxley, the USA Patriot Act, so many. So yeah, them not having control, I could see that being, and they're the financial services, they're the biggest buyers of law firm legal services. So, but what are you guys doing? What's the plan at Nelson Mullins, Torie, on external user access in Teams?
So we do allow external access. We just do it a little bit differently. When we broached the subject, the feedback we received from General Counsel and our technology committee was, if you're inviting a client to a team, our attorneys need to be in the same team. So they struggle with going from one place to another place. Well, my client's here or my client's there. So that seemed to cause more confusion. So we do allow external access into our Microsoft Teams. We very strictly manage that. So you have to contact our help desk and ask for the external account to be created. It's created in our Azure tenant. It's an external user. We apply them to the team. People who are in the Microsoft team are notified, hey, we're inviting the client to this Microsoft team. Please be sure that anything and everything that you post should be accessible by the external user. Let's say it's the client, and it's one location. We also do some things when we set up the team. We put a post out there that just makes sure people know it's very social-like, but it's not social. You are in a work and professional environment. You're still held by your normal ethical rules. So don't post things that you would typically post on social media. When the client is added or an external user is added, we're notifying people, hey, we're adding people in here. It's externally available, able to be shared documents for co-authoring and such. And it's important, but I think that they understand the efficiencies of it, but we just keep them in the same team. So we've kind of taken a different approach than what Myka's done at Dykema. Not saying they never go down that road, just saying it hasn't caused us an issue at this point. So there hasn't been a need to make an adjustment. But if there is, I'm going to call Myka.
Well, I mean, there's risk in both approaches. I think the way Dykema's handling it is there's some more administrative overhead. It probably is a little more explicit, but you could have the same issues, you could still share something inadvertently. So I don't know how this is best practices are going to shake out. It's going to be interesting to see as more and more of this happens. Another benefit of Teams, using Teams as a external collaboration platform, is just everything today is very siloed in terms of collaboration, right? So you have internal collaboration, which, in the intranet world, that's SharePoint. Historically, that's all been on-prem. That's rapidly changing though, and nobody's building new intranets on-prem, like not in the AmLaw space. But even the term intranets and extranets doesn't make sense, right? Intranet means kind of behind your firewall, like extranet means in a DMZ, outwardly facing or in the cloud. So unifying those collaboration platforms so that you don't have to have, an Infodash and a HiQ, you just have Teams, and maybe you use a third-party product like ours to integrate the data that your clients want to see. So I see that as a huge benefit too. What other, so for co-authoring, I know, Torie, you're Nelson Mullins is on NetDocs. Myka, are you NetDocs UI Manage?
We're having this way.
Okay. So for the co-authoring piece, and this will be the last thing we touch on with respect to this, is it Workspaces that syncs your DMS content into a Teams folder where it's then worked on, co-authored, and then pushed back? Torie, is that how it works at Nelson Mullins?
Yes, it's the content connector piece that takes the Microsoft part of the Intap Workspaces, and it connects to our DM. They can pull any document from NetDocuments into the Microsoft team, work on it in a co-authoring environment, save it back. Now, NetDocuments in and of itself has its own co-authoring piece. It just does some things a little bit differently, and you also have to be just so more aware of what's going on if you just stay in NetDocuments. So leveraging it with Microsoft Teams makes it a little bit more efficient and streamlined for us.
Yeah. And then I assume same with you, Myka. You guys are using Workspaces to sync and then push back.
Yes. And it's not, we don't do an automated pushback until after that team is, being archived. But the attorneys can push things back themselves, and it allows them to control the versioning. So if they may have a document that they checked out and kept checked out for quite a while. And I know Torie probably wants to talk about this as well, but it'll allow them to keep that document checked out. And then if they need to create new versions in the DM, they can do so, push it back in and control that profile. So it's really been a great tool to help with that.
Yeah. I feel like there's a lot to dive in on that one, on that front, right? Just the whole, and then there's some new developments coming, like on our panel, Nick from iManage, he's kind of their Microsoft liaison, had mentioned that there's some new features coming out where you can keep the document in iManage, but co-author. Still wouldn't help with Teams. Documents got to be in Teams. At least I can't think of a way for them to bridge that gap. But yeah, so this was kind of the 102 version. Maybe we'll get together again and do a 201 and talk about this, because honestly, I think there's going to be a big appetite for what we're talking about here, because you guys are blazing a trail. There are maybe 5 AM law firms, maybe 7 that are close to where you guys are in terms of doing real client matter work. Lots of Teams usage out there, but it's just that those basic kind of use cases. So I'd love to have you guys back for a 201, especially as you're delving down the external access path, because I'm super excited about that. So, but in the meantime, it was great having you. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
And we look forward to the next conversation.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Legal Innovation Spotlight. If you found value in this chat, hit the subscribe button to be notified when we release new episodes. We'd also really appreciate it if you could take a moment to rate us and leave us a review wherever you're listening right now. Your feedback helps us provide you with top-notch content. Want to dive deeper into the world of legal innovation? Connect with us online at getinfodash.com, where you'll find additional resources and articles. You can also follow us on social media at getinfodash to stay updated on the latest news and insights in the field of legal tech and knowledge management. Once again, thank you for joining us today on Legal Innovation Spotlight, a fireside chat series hosted by Infodash.